The eviction notice trembled in Harold's weathered hands. 79 years old, and the paper might as well have been his death sentence. The landlord's representative stood there, clipboard in hand, tapping his foot like Harold's entire life was just another inconvenience in his Tuesday schedule. "You have 48 hours, sir. After that, we'll have to involve the sheriff's department." The man's voice carried no emotion, no recognition that he was speaking to someone who had once crawled through frozen trenches in Korea while bullets whistled overhead. Harold's neighbors watched from their windows, curtains slightly parted, but nobody stepped forward. Nobody said a word. In a country built on the backs of heroes, heroes were being thrown away like yesterday's newspaper. Harold just nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "I understand." But understanding and accepting are two different things entirely. As the representative walked away, Harold looked down at the notice again. 2 months behind on rent, $740, less than what some people spend on a weekend getaway, but for Harold, it was an impossible mountain. His Social Security check covered his medications, his utilities, and most of his rent, but not quite all of it. And when you're living on a fixed income at 79, there's no room for catching up. There's no overtime. There's no side hustle. There's just the slow, inevitable slide toward homelessness, 1 month at a time. But Harold had no idea that someone was watching. Someone who understood that dignity doesn't retire with age, and that some debts can never truly be repaid. If you believe that those who served our country deserve better than sleeping on park benches, hit that like button, drop a comment saying, "Honor our heroes," and subscribe to this channel. Because what happened next proves that sometimes angels come disguised as strangers, and miracles happen when we least expect them. Harold Raymond Mitchell had seen worse days than this, but somehow this felt different. Maybe it was his age. Maybe it was the arthritis in his joints that made every movement a reminder of time's relentless march. Or maybe it was the simple, crushing weight of being forgotten by the very country he had bled for. He shuffled back into his small apartment, the eviction notice still clutched in his hand, and looked around at the life he was about to lose. It wasn't much by most standards. A threadbare sofa he'd bought at a yard sale 15 years ago, a small television that only got half the channels, a kitchen table where he ate every meal alone, surrounded by photographs of people who were no longer there to share them with him. The photographs told the story of Harold's life better than any biography ever could. There was one of him at 19, fresh-faced and eager in his army uniform, ready to serve his country in a war most people today couldn't even locate on a map. Korea, 1952. The Forgotten War, they called it now, if they called it anything at all. Harold remembered every frozen morning, every sleepless night, every friend who didn't make it home. He remembered the way his breath formed clouds in the gi, sub-zero temperatures, and how they used to joke that hell would be a warm relief after a Korean winter. But mostly, he remembered the promise they'd all made to each other. If we make it home, we'll make it count. Next to his military photo sat a wedding picture from 1956. Harold and his wife, Mary, both beaming with the kind of joy that only comes from surviving something terrible and finding something beautiful on the other side. They'd been married 43 years when cancer took her. The last 5 years of her life had been a battle against hospital bills that even his veterans' benefits couldn't cover. He'd spent their savings, liquidated their retirement, and mortgaged their house to pay for treatments that ultimately couldn't save her. But Harold would have done it all again in a heartbeat, because that's what love looks like when it's real. That's what commitment means when the words "for better or worse" stop being poetry and start being a daily choice. After Mary died, Harold had tried to rebuild. He'd sold their house and moved into this small apartment, thinking he could stretch his Social Security and his small veteran's pension to cover the basics. For a while, it worked. But inflation doesn't care about fixed incomes, and rent doesn't freeze just because you're 79 years old. Little by little, month by month, Harold found himself slipping further behind. He'd stopped buying meat except for special occasions. He'd learned to live without air conditioning in the summer and to keep the heat turned down in the winter. He'd canceled his phone plan and relied on the kindness of neighbors when he needed to make a call. But it still wasn't enough. What happened? Next would restore your faith in humanity, because sometimes the most extraordinary acts of kindness come from the most unexpected places, and sometimes the people who have the power to change everything are the ones who remember what it feels like to have nothing at all. 3 blocks away from Harold's apartment building, Michael Richardson was having the kind of morning that most people only dream about. His construction company had just landed a $12 million contract to build a new shopping complex downtown. His phone was buzzing with congratulatory calls from business partners and competitors alike. By any measure, it was shaping up to be one of the best days of his professional life. But Michael Richardson hadn't always lived in boardrooms and corner offices. 25 years earlier, he'd been a 22-year-old kid with calloused hands and a tool belt, working construction to pay his way through night school. He remembered what it felt like to count every dollar, to choose between gas money and groceries, to lie awake at night wondering if he'd ever be anything more than paycheck to paycheck. Michael had built his success on a foundation of 18-hour days and an unshakable belief that hard work could overcome almost anything. But he'd also built it on the kindness of strangers who had given him chances when he didn't deserve them. Mrs. Henderson, his landlady during his college years, who had let him slide on rent when work was scarce. Joe Martinez, the foreman who had taken a chance on a kid with no experience but plenty of determination. Father O'Brien, who had helped him get his first business loan when the banks wouldn't even return his calls. Michael knew that success wasn't just about individual effort. It was about community, about people lifting each other up, about paying forward the kindness that had been given to him. That's why Michael made it a point to drive through the older neighborhoods of town at least once a week. Not for business reasons, but to stay connected to where he'd come from. To remember that behind every statistic about poverty or homelessness was a real person with a real story. It was during one of these drives that he noticed the small crowd gathered outside Harold's apartment building. Nothing dramatic, just a few neighbors standing around, whispering among themselves with the kind of hushed tones that usually accompany bad news. Michael pulled over and rolled down his window. "Everything okay here?" he called out to a woman standing on the sidewalk. She was probably in her 60s, wearing a faded housecoat and holding a small dog that kept trying to jump out of her arms. "Oh, it's just terrible," she said, walking over to his car. "They're evicting Mr. Mitchell. Harold Mitchell. He's 79 years old, served in Korea, and they're putting him out on the street over $700. $700! Can you believe that? And there's not a thing any of us can do about it. We'd help if we could, but we're all just getting by ourselves, you know?" Michael knew. He knew exactly what it felt like to watch someone suffer and feel powerless to help. But unlike Harold's neighbors, Michael wasn't powerless anymore. He parked his car and walked toward the building, his mind already working through the possibilities. $700. Michael spent more than that on lunch meetings in a typical month. $700 was nothing to him, but it was everything to Harold. It was the difference between having a home and sleeping in a shelter. It was the difference between dignity and desperation. But this story was about to take an extraordinary turn, because Michael Richardson was about to do something that would change both their lives forever. And what started as a simple act of kindness would become something much bigger, something that would remind an entire community what it means to honor those who served. Michael didn't just knock on Harold's door. He researched him first. In the age of the internet, it's possible to learn someone's entire life story in about 15 minutes, and Michael used every one of those minutes. Harold Raymond Mitchell, born 1944 in rural Ohio, enlisted in the Army at 18, served 2 tours in Korea, awarded the Bronze Star for valor during the Battle of Heartbreak Ridge, married Mary Ellen Thompson in 1956, 2 children, both deceased. James had died in a car accident in 1987, and their daughter Sarah had lost her battle with breast cancer in 2003. Mary herself had passed away 5 years ago after a long fight with lung cancer, despite never smoking a day in her life. The more Michael read, the more his heart broke and his resolve strengthened. This wasn't just about $700 in back rent. This was about a man who had given everything to his country, his family, and his community, and who was now facing his final years alone and forgotten. This was about a system that had failed someone who had never failed his country. This was about the kind of injustice that happens every day in America, the kind that most people never see because it happens quietly, behind closed doors, to people who are too proud to ask for help. But Michael saw it, and more importantly, he was going to do something about it. When Michael finally knocked on Harold's door, the old veteran was sitting at his kitchen table, surrounded by the belongings he was trying to decide which to keep and which to leave behind. He could only take what he could carry, and at 79, that wasn't much. He looked up when he heard the knock, probably expecting the landlord's representative again, or maybe one of his neighbors offering sympathy, but not much else. Instead, he found a stranger in an expensive suit, holding a briefcase and wearing the kind of confident expression that Harold hadn't seen directed at him in years. "Mr. Mitchell, my name is Michael Richardson. I was wondering if I could have a few minutes of your time." Harold's first instinct was suspicion. In his experience, men in expensive suits usually brought bad news, and he'd already had enough bad news for one day. But there was something in Michael's eyes, something that reminded Harold of the young soldiers he'd served with all those years ago. A directness, an honesty that couldn't be faked. "I suppose," Harold said, stepping aside to let Michael into his small apartment. What Michael did next shocked everyone because it challenged every assumption about wealth, about generosity, and about what it means to truly honor someone's service to their country. Michael didn't waste time with small talk. He got straight to the point, but he did it with a gentleness that immediately put Harold at ease. "Mr. Mitchell, I know this might sound strange, but I heard about your situation and I'd like to help. I understand you're facing eviction over $700 in back rent." Harold nodded, his cheeks flushing with embarrassment. He'd spent 79 years taking care of himself and others, and having to accept charity felt like admitting defeat. "I appreciate the thought, son, but I don't take handouts. Never have, never will." Michael smiled. "I'm not offering a handout, sir. What I'm offering is something different entirely." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder thick with documents. "I've been looking at properties in this area, and I think I might have found something that would work better for both of us." Harold looked confused, which was exactly what Michael had expected. "I don't understand." "Mr. Mitchell, how would you feel about moving into a house? A real house, with a yard and a garage and enough space to breathe?" Harold's confusion deepened. "Son, I can't afford the rent on this little apartment. How am I supposed to afford a house?" Michael's smile widened. "Because you wouldn't be renting it. You'd be living in it, rent-free, for as long as you want. All I'd ask in return is that you help me understand what it was like to serve in Korea. I'm thinking about writing a book about forgotten heroes, and I could use your perspective." It was a lie, of course. Michael had no intention of writing a book, but he knew Harold well enough already to know that the man would never accept charity, no matter how desperately he needed it. So Michael was offering him something else: purpose, dignity, and a way to contribute something valuable in exchange for help. It was charity disguised as collaboration, and it was exactly what Harold's pride would allow him to accept. Harold stared at Michael for a long moment, trying to process what he was hearing. "You want to give me a house in exchange for stories about the war?" Michael nodded. "Good stories are worth more than money, Mr. Mitchell. And I have a feeling yours are better than most." For the first time in months, Harold smiled. Really smiled, with his whole face, the way he used to smile when Mary was still alive, and the world made sense. "Well," he said slowly, "I suppose I do have a few stories to tell." What happened over the next 3 weeks was nothing short of miraculous. Michael didn't just find Harold a house. He found him the perfect house. A small 2-bedroom ranch home with a fenced backyard and a front porch perfect for sitting and watching the world go by. It was in a quiet neighborhood full of families and retirees, the kind of place where neighbors still waved to each other and children still played in the streets until dark. The house had been on the market for 6 months, priced at $325,000, which was more than Harold had ever imagined spending on anything in his entire life. But Michael didn't just buy the house. He had it renovated. First, New carpet throughout, fresh paint on every wall, updated fixtures in the bathrooms, and a modern kitchen that would have made Mary weep with joy. He had grab bars installed in the shower and railings added to the front steps. He had the yard professionally landscaped and a small garden planted in the back, because he'd noticed the photographs of vegetables that Harold had grown behind his old house, back when he and Mary were still together. The day Harold moved in was the kind of day that reminds you why stories matter, why kindness matters, and why some things are more important than profit margins and quarterly reports. Harold stood in the driveway of his new home, holding the keys in his shaking hands, and wept. Not the bitter tears of loss and frustration that had become so familiar, but tears of gratitude and disbelief. He wept for Mary, who would never see this house but who would have loved every inch of it. He wept for his children, who would have been so proud to see their father honored this way. And he wept for himself, for the young soldier who had crawled through frozen mud in Korea and never imagined that someday a stranger would give him a palace just for surviving. Michael stood beside him, fighting back tears of his own. He'd made a lot of successful business deals in his life, but none of them had felt like this. None of them had reminded him so powerfully why success without purpose is just expensive emptiness. "Thank you," Harold whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you." Michael put his hand on Harold's shoulder. "You already have, sir. Every day you served, every sacrifice you made, every year you've lived with dignity despite everything that's been thrown at you. That's thanks enough." But the story didn't end there. Stories like this never end. They just spread, like ripples in a pond, touching lives in ways that can't be measured or predicted. Within a week of Harold moving into his new home, the local newspaper had picked up the story. Within a month, it had gone national. Harold found himself fielding calls from reporters and producers, all wanting to know more about the mysterious millionaire who had bought a house for a homeless veteran. But Harold always steered the conversation back to the same point. This wasn't really about him, and it wasn't really about Michael. It was about what we owe each other, what we owe the people who serve, and what we owe ourselves as human beings. The ripple effects were immediate and profound. Other veterans in the community began reaching out to Michael, not asking for handouts but offering their own stories, their own perspectives on service and sacrifice. Michael found himself at the center of an informal network of veterans and supporters, all working together to make sure that no other Harold Mitchell would face eviction alone. He established a fund to help veterans facing housing crises, and within 6 months, it had helped 23 families avoid homelessness. But perhaps the most significant change was in Harold himself. For the first time in years, he had purpose again. He became the unofficial historian of his new neighborhood, sharing stories not just about Korea, but about the changes he'd witnessed in American society over nearly 8 decades. Children would stop by his front porch after school to hear about what life was like before the internet, before cell phones, back when neighbors knew each other's names and looked out for each other's children. Parents would bring their teenagers to meet Harold, hoping that his perspective on service and sacrifice might counteract some of the selfishness and entitlement that seemed to define their generation. Harold's house became more than just a home. It became a gathering place, a reminder that wisdom and experience have value, that elderly voices deserve to be heard, and that sometimes the most important conversations happen between people who are decades apart in age, but connected by something deeper than generational differences. Michael continued to visit regularly, not because he felt obligated, but because he genuinely enjoyed Harold's company. Their conversations ranged from Harold's memories of Korea to Michael's struggles with business decisions, from discussions about how America had changed to debates about what it might become. Harold had lived through the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, the moon landing, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the rise of the internet. Michael had built a business empire from nothing and navigated the complex world of modern capitalism. Together, they represented different eras and different perspectives, but they'd found common ground in their shared belief that success without service is meaningless, and that the measure of a society is how it treats its most vulnerable members. The story of Harold and Michael spread far beyond their small town, becoming a symbol of what's possible when compassion meets capability when those who have much choose to share with those who have little. It wasn't just about money, though. Money was certainly part of it. It was about recognition, about dignity, about the simple but profound act of seeing someone who had been invisible for too long. It was about remembering that behind every statistic about veteran homelessness is a real person with a real story, someone who made real sacrifices for abstract concepts like freedom and democracy. But stories like this one also raise uncomfortable questions about the society that allows them to be necessary in the first place. Harold's situation wasn't unique. According to the most recent studies, more than 40,000 veterans experience homelessness on any given night in America. Many of them are elderly, living on fixed incomes that haven't kept pace with the cost of living. Many of them are too proud to ask for help, too dignified to beg, too patriotic to complain about a country that seems to have forgotten their service. They live quietly, struggling silently, disappearing gradually from communities that were once glad to have them. Michael's generosity was extraordinary, but it shouldn't have been necessary. In a country that spends billions on defense contracts and military hardware, there should be no such thing as a homeless veteran. In a society that claims to honor those who serve, there should be systems in place to ensure that people like Harold never face eviction over $700. The fact that individual charity had to step in where institutional support had failed was both inspiring and heartbreaking. Yet Harold's story also demonstrates something hopeful about human nature and American society. It shows that when people are made aware of injustice, many of them want to help. It shows that success creates opportunities for service, and that service creates meaning that mere accumulation of wealth never can. It shows that sometimes the most powerful force for change isn't government programs or charitable organizations, but individual human beings choosing to act with compassion and courage. Harold lived in his new house for 3 more years, and they were among the happiest years of his life since Mary's death. He tended his garden, welcomed visitors to his front porch, and shared his stories with anyone willing to listen. He became a fixture in his neighborhood, the kind of person who made everyone else feel more connected to their community and more proud of their country. When he passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 82, his funeral was attended by hundreds of people, many of whom had never met him but had been touched by his story. Michael spoke at the funeral, sharing memories of their friendship and reflecting on what Harold had taught him about service, sacrifice, and the true meaning of success. He announced that Harold's house would be donated to a local organization that provides transitional housing for veterans, ensuring that Harold would continue to serve others even after his death. It was exactly what Harold would have wanted, Michael said, because Harold had never stopped being a soldier, never stopped serving his country and his community in whatever way he could. The foundation that grew out of Harold's story has now helped more than 500 veterans avoid homelessness, and the number grows every month. Michael has expanded his efforts beyond housing to include job training, mental health services, and educational opportunities for veterans transitioning to civilian life. He frequently speaks at business conferences and community events, challenging other successful entrepreneurs to think about how they can use their resources to serve those who serve them. But perhaps the most lasting impact of Harold's story is the way it changed people's perceptions about aging, about service, and about what we owe each other as members of a community. It reminded people that elderly voices have value, that veteran stories deserve to be heard, and that sometimes the most important thing any of us can do is simply see the people around us who have been rendered invisible by indifference or neglect. Harold's story raises a question that each of us must answer for ourselves. In a world where so many people are struggling in silence, where so many veterans are forgotten, where so many elderly Americans are living in poverty and isolation, what are we going to do about it? We can't all be Michael Richardson, writing checks for hundreds of thousands of dollars. But we can all be the kind of person who notices when someone needs help, who takes the time to listen to stories that deserve to be heard, who chooses compassion over indifference and action over apathy. Because Harold Mitchell wasn't just one old man facing eviction. He was a symbol of everyone who has served and been forgotten, everyone who has sacrificed and been ignored, everyone who has grown old in a society that worships youth and discards experience. His story ended happily because one person chose to act with extraordinary generosity. But there are thousands of other Harolds out there, and their stories are still being written. The question is, what role will we play in how those stories end? If Harold's story moved you, if it reminded you that dignity doesn't retire with age and that service deserves recognition at every stage of life, then share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment about a veteran or elderly person who has impacted your life, because their stories matter too, and their sacrifices deserve to be remembered long after the parades have ended and the speeches have been forgotten.